nobody stop what the Most High put together. We gon' see. In times. Serpents lurking, watchers watching, y'all sure rather stay on point. They lurking. We under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war. We the generation that's gon' get on one accord. Serpents lurking, watchers watching, y'all sure rather stay on point. We under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war.
Ibn Hazm in the 10th century talks about emancipation. God has decreed that the most devout is the noblest, even if he be a negress's bastard, and that the sinner and unbeliever is at the lowest level, even if he is to be the son of the prophets. Isn't it fascinating? You can see the distinction. Almost they're looking at two criteria. The lowest is the negress's bastard, and the highest is the son of the prophets, suggesting that they are at the bottom of the totem pole. Sunan Ibn Majah, Volume 1, do not marry women for their beauty, which may destroy them, or for their money, which may corrupt them. For religion, a slit-nosed black slave woman, if pious, is preferable. You can already see that the words they're using here are very derogatory concerning black people. Muhammad had very strong views on the black color. Bukhari, strong views on black again. The Prophet said, I saw in a dream a black woman with unkempt hair going out of Medina and settling in Mahia. I interpret that as an epidemic of Medina being transferred to Mahia, namely Al-Jufa. A black woman is equal to an epidemic. Now we come to the whole hierarchy within society, and this is something you'll find within Islam. There is an enormous amount of hierarchy, and look and see who and what make up the hierarchy. Piety overweighs blackness, and impiety overweighs whiteness. Alam al-Dudi says, Islam is not just a religion, but a revolutionary ideology and program which seeks to alter the social order and rebuild it in conformity with its own tenets and ideas. And what is this order? Well, let's see what Al-Tabari said, who is the first to write the tafsir in the 10th century. Arabs are the most noble people in lineage, the most prominent and the best indeed. So it turns out that those who are at the top of the hierarchy are the Arabs themselves. We were the first to respond to the call of the Prophet. We are Allah's helpers and the viziers of His messenger. We fight people until they believe in Allah. He who believes in Allah and His messenger has protected his life and possessions from us. As for one who disbelieves, we will fight him forever in Allah's cause. Killing him is a small matter to us. Again, Ibn Taymiyyah, writing in the 13th century and the 14th century, a man married a maidservant who bore him a child. Would that child be free, or would he be an owned slave? Her child, whom she bore from him, would be the property of her master, according to all the imams, heads of the 4 Islamic schools of law, because the child follows the status of his mother in freedom or slavery. If the child is not of the race of Arabs, then he is definitely an owned slave, according to the scholars. Isn't that interesting? So the definition of whether you are a slave or not is whether you belong to an Arab. But the scholars disputed among themselves if he was born from the Arabs, whether he must be enslaved or not, because when Aisha had a maid slave who was an Arab, Muhammad said to Aisha, set this maid free, because she is from the children of Ishmael. Fascinating. They're the definition of who the slaves were to be. Edward William Lane on Egyptian slavery, he talks about Egyptian slavery, and he says the price of a white slave girl is usually from the treble to tenfold that of an Abyssinian, and the price of a black girl about half or 2/3, or considerably more if well instructed in the art of cookery. The black slaves are generally employed as menials. So looking and understanding when they're in Egypt, he could see this differentiation. Yet what's interesting is when you look at Muhammad, take a look at what Al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and Ibn Dan, look at the traditions say about Muhammad, that he had white legs, that he had a white forearm, that Muhammad had white armpits, that he had white abdomen and belly, that he had white skin, that he had a handsome white face. I wasn't aware of this until Sarah showed me this. When you look at how the description of Muhammad is, he is not a black, he's very much a white. Why are the Arabs so concerned that Muhammad be white? Unless there is this coloration, this colorism already imbued in their very thinking. They wanted so much to believe that he was a white man. The appearance of Muhammad, not completely white, according to Al-Bukhari, chapter 4, 56. And then Ibn Musa al-Yasunbi says, anyone who says the Prophet was black should be killed. Fascinating. Can you see why we've got to get this into schools? Why Muslims need to read? This is the elephant in the room that they have not talked about. This is their great men of God, and this is how they felt about black people. Colorism in Islam. Pre-Islamic view on color, pre-Islamic literature. This is before the 7th century. When you look at Arab literature, according to Bernard Lewis, he said, sometimes describe themselves as black in contrast to Persians, who are red, but at other times as red or white in contrast with Africans, who are black. The characteristic color of the Bedouin is variously stated as olive or brown. So there was not a problem. Prior to Islam, there was not a problem with coloration amongst the Arabs. They really did not have any idea of looking down on black people. They themselves even noted at the times that they were black. During the period immediately following the death of the Prophet in 632 AD, the great Islamic conquest took the new faith to vast areas of Asia and also to Africa. A new situation was created, and many changes can be observed in literature of the time. The first of these is the narrowing, specializing, and fixing of color terms applied to human beings. In time, almost all disappear apart from black, red, and white, and these become ethnic and absolute instead of personal and relative. Together with this specialization in fixing of color terms comes a very clear connotation of inferiority attached to darker and more specifically black skins. So this seems to have been introduced immediately after the time of Muhammad. Looks like it's Islam that introduced this idea of the heinousness of the black skin or the black color. Attitudes in literature, early Islamic period. Take a look at African origin poem Suhain in 660. If my color were pink, women would love me. But the Lord has marred me with blackness. Though I am a slave, my soul is nobly free. Though I am black of color, my character is white. I am covered with a black garment, but under it there is a lustrous garment of white skirts. Even this, can you see the colorisms coming in to their poetry? This is 660. This is 30 years after Muhammad's death. 776, now we're another few generations later. We are alike in color, our faces are black and ugly, our name are shameful. What happened from before Islam versus the introduction of Islam? Jahiz of Basra that we referred to earlier, it is part of your ignorance that in the time of heathendom, that is pre-Islamic Arabia, you regarded us blacks as good enough to marry your women, yet when justice of Islam came, you considered this wrong. Even he recognized that Islam brought this idea that there's something wrong with the black people, and you wouldn't let us marry those of us who are black. When we look at the Quran and the Hadith, the Quran, of course, being the original, their primary revelation, the Hadith being secondary revelation, Bernard Lewis says, black is somehow connected with sin, evil, deviltry, and damnation, while white has the opposite associations. Surah 3, Ayah 106, on the day, that means the day of resurrection, when some faces will become white and some faces will become black. As for those whose faces will become black, to them will be said, did you reject faith after accepting it? Then taste the torment in hell for rejecting faith. So those who are going to hell have black faces. Surah 39, Ayah 60, and on the day of resurrection you will see those who lied about Allah with their faces blackened. Is there not in hell a residence for the arrogant? Again, suggesting there's something wrong with the color black, even in the Quran. In the traditions of the Hadith, Jami al-Tirmidhi, one of the six most authoritative Hadith, Ibn Abbas narrated saying, the messenger of Allah said, the black stone descended from paradise, and it was more white than milk. Then it was blackened by the sins of the children of Adam. That's the black stone that's now in the Kaaba. Al-Bukhari narrated Anas ibn Malik saying, Allah's messenger said, you should listen to and obey your ruler even if he was an Ethiopian black slave whose head looked like a raisin. Sunan al-Nasa, another one of the six, Musa al-Masabi, narrates this, that Jabbar said a slave came and pledged the Prophet to emigrate, and the Prophet did not realize that he was a slave. Then his master came looking for him. The Prophet said, sell him to me, and he bought him for 2 black slaves. Then he did not accept the pledge for anyone else until he asked, is he a slave? What about the treatment of black slaves? That in areas like North Africa, the Middle East, and Turkey, black slaves did the meanest and hardest work. The first generation and plantation slaves in Muslim lands were as harsh and cruel as any other such system, while successive generations of all slaves had to live under the weight and stigma of racial and social discrimination. Al-Tabari talks about the Zanj, the African blacks employed in groups of 500 to 5,000 in salt marshes of southern Iraq. Their condition was extremely bad, and they were literally pinned down there hopeless and homeless. This bad treatment led to numerous slave revolts beginning in 689 AD. From 639, we have the Arab conquest into Africa, and there is very little evidence of slave raids in Africa before the Muslim involvement. An Ashanti ruler stated, which is interesting, this predates the Muslim coming into Africa, "I cannot make war to catch slaves in the bush like a thief. My ancestors never did so," suggesting that this was not something that was done before Islam. Muslim slave trade did not need men. They needed women, mainly for sex. These are for their harems. Therefore, they destroyed the men. They killed off the men, except certain numbers of men. 15% of the men were kept, and they were castrated as eunuchs to take care of the women. What John Azuma found when he looked at these castrated eunuchs, 85% of them never survived the trip because of their wounds. 85% of the eunuchs never survived the trip. Why have we not heard this before? This has never been brought to the public. Mortality rate for the Atlantic slave trade, for the Islamic slave trade was 80 to 90% died on the way. The mortality rate for the transatlantic slave trade was 10%.
Now let's go and let's talk about Arab superiority. Let's talk about racism now. Let's talk about Arab racism. And let's go to Al-Tabari. Now, who is Al-Tabari?
Al-Tabari is a very important historian of Islam.
And why is he important? Because he is the first one to write down the tafsir.
Yes.
He is the first one to write down the explanation of how the Quran was written.
Extremely important.
So what does Al-Tabari say about Arabs?
Al-Tabari says Arabs are the most noble in lineage, the most prominent, and the best in deeds. We were the first to respond to the call of prophets. It's talking about Arabs. We are Allah's helpers and the viziers of his messenger. We fight people until they believe in Allah. He who believes in Allah and his messenger has protected his life and possessions from us. As for one who disbelieves, we will fight him forever in Allah's cause. Killing him is a small matter to us.
This is Al-Tabari saying that the Arabs are the best race.
What's the movement? I was raised in one of those mosques, you understand? But I had to walk away, because I saw how we completely ignored black people's problems. We completely ignored black culture. We completely ignored the black reality. It was all Islam. Learn your Arabic. And I'm like, I'm a practicing Arab. I'm not practicing Islam. I'm practicing Arabism. Why do I got to learn Arab language to worship God? Why do I got to eat like the Arab to worship God? Why do I got to dress like the Arab to worship God? This is not the worship of God. This is the deification of Arabic culture. And that's why I walked away from it.
A.J. Swan describes one of Tipu Tib's slave caravans that he encountered during the last quarter of the 19th century. As they filed past, we noticed many chained together by the neck. The women, who are as numerous as the men, carried babies on their backs in addition to the tusk of ivory or other burden on their heads. It is difficult to adequately describe the filthy state of their bodies. In many instances, not only scarred by the cut of the chicote, a piece of hide used to enforce obedience, but feet and shoulders were a mass of open sores. Half-starved, ill-treated creatures who, weary and friendless, must have longed for death. In conversation, one of the headmen admitted that most of the slaves died during the journey of hunger and exhaustion. When asked what happens if any of the slaves became too ill or weak to continue the journey, the headman replied, "Spear them at once, for if we did not, others would pretend they are ill in order to avoid carrying their loads. No, we never leave them alive on the road. They all know this custom." In response to another question as to who carries the ivory when a mother, carrying a baby and ivory, gets too tired to carry both, the headman replied, "She does. We cannot leave valuable ivory on the road. We spear the child and make her burden lighter. Ivory first, child afterwards." The route from the interior of Africa through Lake Tanganyika to the coast was littered with skeletons as a result of slaves dying from exhaustion, hunger, or the brutality of their couriers, sometimes still yoked together. Deaths during the journeys were so numerous that it has been estimated that for every slave who reached the coast in Zanzibar, 4 or 5 lives were lost in transit. An Arab slave dealer by name Sayyid bin Habib is reported in 1882 to have admitted that out of 300 slaves he acquired from the interior, only 50 reached the coast alive. David Livingstone observed that if the slaughter committed during the raids is taken into account, in addition to the deaths along the routes, then the price of every single slave who arrived at Zanzibar would be about 10 lives. Bustling slave markets emerged in Zanzibar and along the East African coast. Many eyewitness accounts talk in very sobering terms of the loss of life along the route. One such account, given by an eyewitness in 1822, talks about a well near Bir Moshuru, where the ground around is strewed with human skeletons, the slaves who have arrived exhausted with thirst and fatigue. At one spot, there were more than 100 skeletons. Gustav Nachtigall talked about littered skeletons and, half buried in the sand, the mummified corpses of some children, still covered with the blue cotton rags, at the same well. At other wells referred to as the wells of El Hamar, the skeletons were countless. The route itself was equally littered with skeletons accumulated at the rate of 80 and 90 a day. According to one Major Denham, the Arabs laughed heartily at my expression of horror and said they are only blacks, Nambu, damn their fathers, and began knocking their limbs about with the butt end of their firelock, saying, "This was a woman, this was a youngster." The methods of killing exhausted or sick slaves and those who attempted to escape in East Africa were also used on the Trans-Saharan route. Nachtigall accompanied a caravan of hundreds of slaves from Bagrimi to the slave markets of Kuka and witnessed exhausted and sick slaves being slaughtered and their arteries cut open. A French observer estimated that the price for one slave sold in the slave markets of North Africa might represent the loss of 10 others who were killed in the raids or died in transit. Apart from this significantly high loss of life during the raids and the journey into servitude, conservative estimates suggest that between 11 and 14 million Africans were transported into Muslim lands outside tropical Africa over the past 14 centuries. A highly reputable 19th century Moroccan historian described the traffic and sale of blacks in North Africa markets as the heinousness of the affliction which has beset the lands of the Maghreb since ancient times in regard to the indiscriminate enslaving of the people of the Sudan, and the importation of droves of them every year to be sold in the marketplaces in town and country, where men trade in them as one would trade in beasts, nay, worse than that. People have become so inured to that, generation after generation, that many common folk believe that the reason for being enslaved, according to the holy law, is merely that a man should be black in color and come from those regions. The holiest city of Islam, Mecca, became the center of the slave trade in the world and remained so well into the 20th century. From there, slaves captured and brought from East Africa and the Sudan were distributed to all parts of Arabia and the Muslim world. It became a custom for pilgrims to take slaves for sale in Mecca or buy 1 or 2 slaves while on Hajj as souvenirs to be kept, sold, or given as gifts. High-ranking Muslims who performed the pilgrimage are known to have always taken along large contingents of slaves as porters and guards, and to tend their master's needs. One of those needs was, as one writer puts it, cash. Owners often used slaves as a kind of traveler's check. Mansa Musa of Mali, during pilgrimage in 1324 CE, took along a vast number of dignitaries and slaves to serve the same purposes. Slaves became a permanent feature of pilgrimage arrangements. Many unsuspecting free people were taken on pilgrimage, sold or arrested on trumped-up charges, and ultimately ended up as slaves. A significant proportion of male black slaves were castrated and used in Muslim lands as eunuchs to guard their harems and serve as attendants at holy sites such as the Kaaba at Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque at Medina. They formed a special class of highly priced slaves kept by Muslim rulers and bourgeois from the heart of the Muslim world to Muslim Africa. Ethiopia was for a very long time the main source of eunuchs from the Muslim world, even though from the mid-18th century, Bagirimi became the main exporter. The operation, done on boys aged between 8 and 10, though prohibited under Islam, was carried out with an exceedingly high death rate. Gustav Nachtigall was told that, on the whole, about 30% survived the operation in Bagirimi, while other estimates put the mortality rate up to 80%. This barbaric act was made particularly cruel for black victims in that, in contrast to their white counterparts, whose operation did not deny them the ability to perform coitus, the castration of blacks involved what was popularly referred to as a level with the abdomen, i.e., a complete amputation of the genitalia.
In his hand, destruction gotta come, that's how he get us out this lane. The devil working hard, trying to get us out his plane. His sheep hear his voice, so he can't get us out his hand. We gon' trust the Son of Man, blow your wings, Father. Your kingdom coming, we just trying to make it in, Father. Rather we